In the year 1300, the ageing yet still determinedly energetic King Edward the First held a council at Carlisle with all his leading barons. As you may have gathered from the northerly location of this great meeting, the King of England's intention was to yet again wage war on Scotland, where he would lay siege to Caerlaverock Castle. One chronicle goes into extensive detail as to who accompanied King Edward on the latest of his military campaigns. The vast army included men who will play such a dramatic role in the reign of Edward's son, Edward II. Among these notable names were Thomas Earl of Lancaster, Guy de Beauchamp, the Earl of Warwick, Hugh de Spencer the Elder, and not forgetting the future king himself, Prince Edward. The prince at this stage was 16 years old, and this was an opportunity to further his education in the art of kingship. His father was one of the great warrior kings of the age, and so Prince Edward had the perfect role model to learn from when it came to commanding a royal army. While 16 may appear to be young when it comes to participating in medieval warfare, Prince Edward's grandson, Edward the Black Prince, was that same age when he played a starring role at the Battle of Crecy in 1346. But although Edward I was providing his son and heir the opportunity of learning the ropes of kingship, it would all, in the long term, prove to no avail. Around the time of the siege of Caerlaverock, a young man had arrived in England and made a particular impression on both the king and in particular Prince Edward. His name was Piers Gaveston, and he would join the heir to the throne's household, where he would develop an almost bewitching influence over the prince. For the time being, King Edward was not too disturbed by who his son made friends with, and indeed he initially took a liking to Piers himself, impressed by Piers's martial skills. As it was, the king concentrated his attention on the Scots for the time being at least. Heavily armed, with countless banners fluttering as they went, Edward's army left Carlisle and marched north. They would have posed a most daunting sight, and it was to Caerlaverock Castle that Edward's army was directed. The previous year, the Scottish garrison at Caerlaverock had launched an opportunistic raid on an English held fortress, and Edward was not a man who forgave easily. Caerlaverock's garrison, claimed one writer, had been emboldened by the strength of the castle that they held. Should Edward seek revenge for the previous year's events, as surely they must have expected he would, then they trusted Caerlaverock's defences to hold out against any siege that should follow. As it was, Edward could not and did not expect an easy surrender. The unusual shape of Caerlaverock Castle saw it being described as shield-like, with only three sides and the walls robust and strong. Located only a few miles from Dumfries, Caerlaverock was within sight of the Irish Sea, close enough to provide another potential difficulty for approaching enemy armies. Woodland and marshes would make Edward's approach all the more problematic, and he and his men would be obliged to march on Caerlaverock from the east. The king could not expect an easy capture of the castle, and so he began to draw up his battle plans. From the castle walls, looking down, the defenders could see golden banners, glittering of silver swords, and the approach of an impressive English army setting up camp in expectance of a potentially protracted siege, although Edward, being a man of action, would do his level best to bring a swift conclusion to the siege, a conclusion in his favour, of course. Although in times past the closeness of the sea may have worked in Caerlaverock's defenders' favour, now it stood against them. Edward had ordered siege engines to be brought by sea, and the swift arrival of the fleet dealt a blow to the Scots. Almost immediately, Edward ordered his men to batter the walls with stones and rocks, his archers to let loose their arrows, and his soldiers to storm the walls. But despite the ferocity of the attack, the Scots resisted defiantly and inflicted heavy losses on the English. More and more men threw themselves into the mix, One knight named Sir Ralph de Gorges was struck to the ground on more than one occasion by the shower of missiles that were raining down on him, but his spirit unbroken and unbowed, he leapt to his feet time and again, continuing the fight. Among those attempting to storm the castle walls included Sir Robert de Tony and Sir Richard de Rokeley, who, through their mighty wields of the sword, forced the defenders of Caerlaverock further and further back. But the resistance against the English remained defiant. As soon as one defender became exhausted, another would come to relieve him. From that July day into the night, the fighting continued, and the King of England continued to be frustrated. He ordered the employment of a further 3 siege engines, and eventually the resistance began to crumble. The defenders of Caerlaverock now had no option but to throw themselves on the mercy of Edward I. But Edward was not a king you wanted to make an enemy out of. For their steadfast and dogged resistance, Edward had many of those taken prisoner, hanged. Caerlaverock had fallen. For Prince Edward, he had been given a brutally efficient masterclass by his father in the art of siege warfare. At 16, he was reaching the age, if not already there, where he could be expected to take a prominent role in a royal army. But as the future would show, most of the lessons the prince had been presented with were not absorbed. Whilst he had fleeting successes against the many enemies he had made as king in England, Edward II's Scottish campaigns were a complete and utter disaster. Whilst the Scots had plenty to fear from Edward I, they had no such problems with his successor. Led by the likes of Robert the Bruce and James the Black Douglas, the Scots inflicted bruising defeats on Edward II, most famously at Bannockburn in 1314. But for Edward, his priorities were not winning wars in Scotland, though he did try, nor was it governing England properly. Edward instead focused heavily on indulging his favourites, first Piers Gaveston, and then the Despensers, in particular Hugh the Younger. The days of watching his father laying siege to Caerlaverock were soon forgotten by Prince Edward, and it wasn't long before Edward I realised the lessons he was trying to teach his son were falling on deaf ears. The old king soon turned against Piers and berated his heir for falling under Piers's spell, but try as he might, he could not mould the prince into a suitable successor for Edward I, the Hammer of the Scots.